Disrespect often begins where assumptions take root, and in this courtroom, those assumptions were planted long before the hearing even began. The atmosphere carried an unspoken tension, the kind that reveals itself in glances, in tone, in the way people shift in their seats when someone unexpected enters the room. When the black general walked in, wearing a simple suit with no medals or visible signs of rank, he was seen not as a man of honor, but as another defendant, another face in the crowd. The judge barely lifted his head, the officer leaned back in his chair, and the whispers in the back row carried a tone of quiet judgment. None of them recognized the weight of the person standing before them. They only saw what they wanted to see, a man who didn't belong in a place of authority, a man who could be spoken down to. That's how assumption breeds disrespect. It blinds people to truth and humanity. The general had faced prejudice before, it wasn't new to him. He had seen it on the battlefield when orders were questioned because of the color of his skin. He had seen it in briefings, where his ideas were ignored until repeated by someone else. But this was different. This was not a war zone. This was a courtroom, a place where justice was supposed to rise above bias. Yet here it was, alive and breathing in every dismissive gesture. The judge's clipped words carried that subtle sharpness, a tone used when one feels superior. The officer's smirk added insult to injury, as if he was waiting to see the man falter, to prove his own assumptions right. The general remained calm, his face unreadable, his posture still. He knew that responding with anger would only feed the narrative already written for him. He had lived his life mastering the art of patience, turning moments of humiliation into quiet victories of dignity. Every insult, every overlooked moment, had forged something stronger in him. What they didn't realize was that the man they were looking down on had commanded hundreds of soldiers, had made life-and-death decisions under the weight of responsibility they couldn't imagine. He had served his country with honor, and yet, standing there in that courtroom, none of that mattered, not to them, not yet. It's a tragedy of human behavior that respect often depends on titles, uniforms, or recognition. Without them, people forget to look deeper. The judge and the officer were not overtly cruel, they were simply confident in their perception. They had grown comfortable in their authority, blind to the possibility that their assumptions could betray them. They thought they knew power when they saw it, but they couldn't recognize true strength standing quietly in front of them. The general's silence was not weakness. It was restraint. His calmness was not submission. It was control. And that control was far greater than anything the courtroom could impose on him. As the hearing proceeded, the undercurrent of disrespect didn't fade. It was in the interruptions, in the way the officer raised his voice unnecessarily, in how the judge cut off the general mid-sentence, assuming his words lacked value. Each moment was a small act of dismissal, a subtle erosion of dignity disguised as procedure. They thought they were asserting order, but in truth, they were revealing their prejudice. Every time the general tried to speak, he was met with impatience. Every explanation was brushed aside before it was even finished. And yet, he never wavered. He stood tall, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. What neither the judge nor the officer could comprehend was that this man had faced far greater challenges. He had led missions in places where one mistake could cost lives. He had dealt with political pressure, military hierarchy, and the heavy burden of leadership. Compared to that, this courtroom was just another battlefield, one where his enemy was ignorance, not violence. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand respect. He carried it with him. It was etched into his very being, built from years of discipline, sacrifice, and service. Assumption strips people of fairness. It turns individuals into caricatures based on skin color, appearance, or status. And that's exactly what was happening here. The judge saw a black man and assumed guilt before evidence. The officer saw no visible badge of rank and assumed inferiority. They both saw what their bias allowed them to see. They didn't see the years of service, the medals earned through courage, the lives saved under his command. They didn't see the man who had stood for justice long before stepping into their courtroom. They didn't see the general, they only saw their version of him. And so, the disrespect continued, not through direct insults, but through the quiet, consistent denial of humanity. The kind of disrespect that cuts deeper because it pretends to be professionalism. The kind that hides behind formality but is rooted in prejudice. In that moment, the general stood as both witness and victim of a deeper social flaw, the ease with which people decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. What they didn't know was that every second they underestimated him, they were writing their own downfall, piece by piece, in the story that was about to unfold before them. Discipline is often misunderstood by those who have never had to live by it. It is not about silence or submission, it is about self-control, about knowing when to speak and when to let the world reveal its own ignorance. The black general stood before a system that had already judged him, yet his composure never cracked. His calmness wasn't the stillness of fear, but the steadiness of a man who has faced storms far greater than arrogance or prejudice. The cop's mocking smirk, the judge's condescending tone, none of it reached the core of who he was. Years of military service had taught him that emotions can be weapons if not managed, and restraint can sometimes be the loudest form of strength. Every movement he made was deliberate. The way he clasped his hands, the way his eyes stayed forward, the even tone of his responses, everything reflected a lifetime of discipline. He had learned that real power does not always come from commanding others, but from mastering oneself. In the military, he had faced soldiers who broke under pressure, leaders who lost control when things didn't go their way. But he had also learned that control, true control, is the difference between chaos and order. That control now guided him as he stood in that courtroom, surrounded by people who thought they could define him with their narrow judgments. Discipline had become his armor. It shielded him from words that were meant to provoke, from gestures meant to humiliate. Every insult that tried to find a way into his mind hit that armor and fell silent. The officer who interrupted him, raising his voice as if to assert dominance, found no reaction. The judge, who tried to cut him off mid-sentence, saw only composure. It wasn't defiance, it was discipline, the kind that says, "You cannot move me." Inside, the general was not unfeeling. He was aware of every slight, every ounce of disrespect. But he also knew that reacting in anger would only confirm what they expected of him. Instead, he let his restraint speak for him. The discipline of a soldier is built through repetition and hardship. It is born in the early mornings of relentless training, in the nights spent awake planning for missions, in the moments when fear must be swallowed for the sake of those who follow you. This man had lived those moments for decades. His entire life had been about staying composed under pressure, about never allowing emotions to dictate judgment. That discipline was not something he turned on and off, it was who he was. It was stitched into his every word, every breath, every pause. Even now, when stripped of recognition, it was the one thing no one could take from him. When the cop tried to belittle him, calling him, "Sir," with sarcasm, the general simply looked him in the eye, not with anger, but with a quiet authority that unsettled the room. It wasn't the look of a man intimidated, it was the look of a man who had seen worse, faced worse, and risen above it every time. His discipline did not allow him to break character, because he understood that dignity is not given by others, it is upheld by self-control. The officer didn't realize it yet, but his attempt to provoke the general only exposed his own weakness. It was he, not the man he mocked, who lacked control. The judge, too, found himself oddly unsettled by the general's poise. He expected frustration, excuses, perhaps a burst of emotion that would make it easy to dismiss the man before him. Instead, he was met with a calm that felt unshakable, a composure that carried weight even in silence. The general spoke only when necessary, his tone steady, his words precise. There was something about that steadiness that made even the courtroom air feel different. The discipline that defined him began to shift the balance of power in the room, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. Years of leadership had taught him that true command is not about shouting orders, it's about earning respect through example. That's what his discipline represented now. It wasn't just about self-restraint, it was a reflection of mastery over ego. He didn't need to remind anyone of his rank or his accomplishments. He didn't need to flash medals or demand acknowledgement. His presence alone spoke volumes. Every calm response, every patient silence, carried the weight of experience, of years spent leading men through chaos while keeping his own mind clear. That was discipline in its purest form. There is a quiet kind of power in refusing to be shaken. The general's demeanor told a story without words, a story of every time he had been underestimated, and every time he had proven people wrong through action, not argument. The same discipline that kept him alive on the battlefield now protected him from the injustice of prejudice. He understood that sometimes the greatest victory is not in fighting back but in standing firm until truth exposes itself. His stillness became a statement of strength, one that no insult could diminish. Every second he remained calm, the authority of the room began to shift, not toward those who spoke the loudest, but toward the one who needed no defense at all. Power hidden behind humility is often the most misunderstood form of strength. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't seek validation, and it doesn't need recognition to exist. The black general embodied this perfectly. From the moment he entered the courtroom, there was nothing flashy about him, no uniform, no medals, no entourage to signify status. To the untrained eye, he was just another man, perhaps even an unimportant one. But that was his quiet advantage. Humility had become his shield, and within it lay a power that few could comprehend until it revealed itself. While others sought attention, he had long learned that the strongest leaders are those who can command a room without uttering a word. Humility is not weakness. It is knowing exactly what you are capable of but choosing not to flaunt it. The general's life had been built around this principle. In the military, he had been taught that ego clouds judgment and that arrogance breeds mistakes. His rise through the ranks was not because he demanded respect, but because he earned it through integrity and consistency. In a world that often celebrates loud confidence, his quiet strength set him apart. He didn't need to tell anyone who he was, he let his actions define him. Now, in that courtroom, that same humility made others misjudge him. The cop saw modesty as submission, and the judge mistook politeness for weakness. What they didn't realize was that true power often hides behind calmness, and humility is the mask that greatness wears until the right moment arrives. As the hearing unfolded, the general spoke only when necessary, each word measured, each phrase deliberate. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue to prove a point. He had spent years leading people under extreme pressure, where panic could cost lives, and he knew the value of staying composed. The courtroom, to him, was no different from a battlefield in that sense. Chaos surrounded him, authority tested him, and yet his silence carried more authority than the loudest voices in the room. That's what humility does, it creates a presence that doesn't depend on volume, but on energy, on self-awareness, on unshakable inner confidence. The officer continued to talk down to him, expecting submission, waiting for a reaction that would justify his bias. But the general offered none. He met every insult with calm acknowledgement, every disrespectful gesture with quiet grace. There was something unsettling about his demeanor, something that made the officer's arrogance begin to feel smaller. Because when you stand before someone who is truly in control of themselves, your own lack of control becomes obvious. The judge, too, began to sense it, a strange unease that came not from defiance, but from dignity. The general's humility carried an invisible weight, one that neither authority nor position could diminish. What made his humility so powerful was that it came from choice, not circumstance. He didn't act humble because he felt lesser than others, he acted humble because he understood that strength doesn't need to boast. He could have walked in with his credentials, demanded immediate respect, revealed his status, and silenced everyone within seconds. But he didn't. He wanted truth to unfold naturally. He wanted them to see themselves, how quick they were to disrespect someone they thought was beneath them. He knew that revelation carries more impact when people reach it on their own. That patience, that willingness to stay silent while being underestimated, is what separates true leaders from those who only wear the title. Every time the general lowered his gaze or paused before speaking, he was practicing the same discipline that had guided him through years of service. Humility wasn't something he put on for appearances, it was who he was. It was born from understanding how fragile power can be, how fleeting recognition is, and how easily pride can destroy character. His humility allowed him to see beyond ego, beyond the moment, beyond the need to win an argument. It allowed him to hold his ground without aggression, to correct without humiliation, and to command respect without asking for it. The power within that humility was quiet but undeniable. It was in the way he listened without interruption, in the way he stood without fidgeting, in the way he met arrogance with composure. Those who mistake humility for weakness forget that it takes immense inner strength to remain calm when provoked, to stay respectful when disrespected, and to remain grounded when surrounded by ignorance. The general's silence was not emptiness, it was full of presence, full of meaning, full of restrained strength. It was the kind of silence that makes people uneasy because it forces them to confront their own behavior. As the minutes passed, the courtroom dynamic began to shift. The same people who dismissed him at first started to hesitate before speaking to him. The same officer who mocked him began to lose confidence in his tone. Humility had turned into quiet dominance. It didn't happen through argument or display, it happened through presence. The general didn't need to remind anyone of his accomplishments, his character did that for him. That's the essence of power hidden behind humility, it doesn't need to fight to be seen. It simply waits, knowing that when truth arrives, it will speak louder than any defense could ever manage. Truth has a way of revealing itself when the moment is right, and when it does, it doesn't just correct assumptions, it shatters them. In that courtroom, the truth about the black general's identity was like a silent storm waiting to break. For so long, the judge and the cop had spoken down to him, their arrogance feeding off their ignorance. They thought they were dealing with an ordinary man, someone easy to dismiss or control. But beneath that calm exterior stood a figure of immense authority, a man whose very name commanded respect across ranks and nations. The revelation was not sudden, it built slowly, piece by piece, until the truth unfolded before their eyes and left the entire room frozen in disbelief. The moment began with a small detail, something subtle, perhaps a name mentioned in passing, a document presented, or a phone call answered in the background. The judge, who had been impatiently flipping through papers, suddenly paused. The officer, who had been smirking moments earlier, leaned forward with confusion. The general hadn't announced who he was because he never needed to. He had allowed their actions to speak first, to show what happens when power and prejudice collide. Now, as the truth began to surface, the very same people who had looked down on him felt the ground beneath them begin to shift. When the truth hit, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence that followed said more than any words could. The judge's face stiffened, his voice faltered slightly as he reread the name in the file. The officer's arrogance drained away, replaced by the pale realization that the man he had disrespected outranked every person in the room, including himself. The general stood exactly as he had before, calm, composed, steady. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even raise his eyes to watch their reaction. His silence became a mirror, forcing them to confront their own behavior. The very man they thought was powerless was the one who could, with a single phone call, change everything. Truth is powerful not just because it exposes lies, but because it reveals character. In that instant, the judge and the cop saw themselves clearly for the first time. Every dismissive remark, every tone of mockery, every assumption made without thought, it all came back to them like an echo they couldn't silence. The room felt heavier, not because of his rank, but because of the moral weight of what they had done. The general didn't need to lecture them, the truth itself became the lesson. It stood between them, undeniable and unyielding, showing them how shallow their judgment had been. The officer stammered, trying to regain footing, his earlier confidence gone. He attempted to apologize, to justify his behavior, but the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. The judge cleared his throat, his usual authority replaced with awkward respect. They were no longer in control of the room, the dynamic had shifted completely. The man they had treated like an inferior was, in fact, a decorated leader, a man who had dedicated his life to serving the very country that allowed them to hold their positions. The irony was brutal, and yet the general stood with the same quiet dignity he had carried from the beginning. Truth revealed not only their mistake but the deeper issue beneath it, the ease with which they had assumed superiority based on appearance. They didn't question his background or his achievements, they simply saw a black man and made their judgment. That truth cut deeper than any reprimand could. It wasn't just about disrespecting a high-ranking officer, it was about what their behavior said about them as individuals. They had exposed themselves long before his identity was revealed. The general didn't need to defend his worth, they had already shown their lack of it through their treatment of him. In that moment, humility met revelation, and power redefined itself. The general remained silent not out of vengeance, but because he understood the impact of restraint. He knew that sometimes the best way to teach is to let the truth do the talking. The officer shifted uncomfortably, realizing how easily he had thrown respect aside when he thought it wasn't required. The judge's authority seemed fragile now, cracking under the weight of his own prejudice. They had built their confidence on false assumptions, and truth had stripped that foundation bare. Every title, every robe, every badge suddenly meant less in front of the man who had carried true leadership all along. The room no longer felt like a courtroom, it felt like a reckoning. The truth had leveled the ground, erasing the false hierarchies that arrogance had built. The general's quiet presence filled the space in a way that no position of authority could match. His silence had turned into a statement stronger than any verdict. The revelation wasn't about proving superiority, it was about exposing the fragility of bias. And as the truth settled into the room, the same people who had spoken so loudly before found themselves speechless, realizing that respect is not something you grant when convenient, it is something you owe, regardless of who stands before you. Shock and regret have a way of washing over people when they realize the depth of their mistake, and in that courtroom, the moment truth settled, those emotions hit with full force. The judge, who had spent most of the hearing projecting authority, suddenly found himself shrinking beneath the weight of his own words. The officer, who once spoke with smug confidence, now couldn't meet the general's eyes. The air was different now, thicker, quieter, heavier. Every second of silence carried the echo of their earlier arrogance. What had seemed like a simple interaction between figures of authority and a supposed subordinate had turned into a powerful moment of reckoning, where every disrespectful tone, every dismissive gesture, came back like a reflection they couldn't escape. Regret is not just an emotion, it's a confrontation with one's own conscience. The judge tried to compose himself, but even his measured voice carried hesitation now. He rephrased his sentences with unnecessary politeness, his tone trembling slightly. The officer, fidgeting at the side, seemed unsure whether to stand at attention or sit quietly. Their earlier certainty had vanished. The man they had humiliated was not only a decorated general but a figure of integrity whose service history was marked by courage, leadership, and sacrifice. They had looked down on him because of what they assumed, and now that assumption hung over them like a shadow that wouldn't fade. Shock makes people freeze, but regret makes them see. The judge's mind replayed every moment of the interaction, each time he interrupted, each tone of condescension, each word that now sounded cruel in retrospect. The officer's smirk from earlier became a memory he wished he could erase. They had not only disrespected a man of high rank, they had disrespected the very values their positions were meant to uphold: justice, fairness, and respect. The general, still silent, stood as a mirror to their actions. He didn't need to lecture them, his composure said everything. His calm presence amplified their discomfort, and in that silence, the lesson became painfully clear. The courtroom that had once been filled with quiet authority was now filled with quiet shame. No one spoke for a long time. The clerk looked down, avoiding eye contact, sensing the tension. The general remained composed, his expression unchanged. His silence wasn't cold, it was dignified. It wasn't the silence of someone seeking revenge, but of someone allowing others to confront themselves. Every person in that room could feel the moral weight of what had just unfolded. The power dynamic had completely reversed, not through anger or aggression, but through truth and grace. The judge realized that in all his years on the bench, he had never been so aware of his own bias until that very moment. The officer's regret was more visible. His face, once smug and confident, was now pale and tense. He tried to speak, to apologize, but the words stumbled in his throat. What could he possibly say? That he didn't mean it? That he didn't know? Ignorance was no longer an excuse. He had seen the general as less than himself, and now that the truth had stripped away that illusion, all that remained was guilt. His mind raced through every protocol, every lesson he'd been taught about professionalism, realizing how easily prejudice had erased them. He had failed not just as an officer but as a human being. Regret is a cruel teacher because it doesn't offer comfort, it forces reflection. The judge finally found his voice, attempting to regain composure, addressing the general with a tone that carried both respect and apology. But no apology could undo what had already been done. The general didn't respond with anger or pride, he simply nodded, his expression unreadable. That single gesture carried more weight than any speech could. It told them he understood, but it also reminded them that understanding comes with consequence. The look in his eyes wasn't vengeful, it was the look of a man who had seen too many moments like this before, a man tired of being underestimated before being respected. The regret in the room wasn't confined to just the two men who had wronged him. Even those observing felt it. The quiet whispers that had once judged him now turned into murmurs of disbelief and guilt. People who had followed the tone set by the judge and officer now wished they hadn't. The general's strength wasn't in revealing his title, it was in how he carried himself through disrespect without lowering his dignity. And now, that same strength made everyone else confront their own flaws. The courtroom, once a place of judgment, had become a place of realization. Shock had broken their arrogance, and regret had stripped away their excuses. The general remained the only one unchanged. His calmness, his patience, his quiet authority, these stood in stark contrast to the chaos of emotions that now consumed the others. The officer looked down, unable to meet his gaze. The judge adjusted his papers repeatedly, avoiding the silence that hung between them. They had learned, perhaps for the first time, that power without respect is meaningless, and that authority without humility is fragile. The regret they felt now was more than embarrassment, it was awakening, a harsh reminder that every assumption, every act of disrespect, carries a price that truth will always make them pay. Respect and equality are not given because of titles or appearances, they are owed because of shared humanity. The courtroom that once echoed with judgmental voices now carried a silence thick with understanding. The moment of truth had passed, and in its wake came reflection, a reflection not only on what had been said and done, but on what it revealed about people's hearts. The black general stood as a living reminder of what true respect looks like, not because of his rank or uniform, but because of the way he carried himself when others failed to see his worth. The judge and the officer, stripped of their assumptions, found themselves confronting a truth much deeper than authority or law. It was the truth about equality, the simple, timeless principle that every person deserves dignity, no matter who they are or what they look like. The general had never raised his voice, never demanded recognition, and yet his quiet strength spoke volumes. His restraint had turned into a mirror that forced others to see the smallness of their prejudice. What began as an act of disrespect had transformed into a lesson about humanity. The officer, still processing his own guilt, realized that respect shouldn't come only after learning someone's title. If the man had been an ordinary citizen, his dignity would have still deserved protection. The judge, known for his sternness, felt a shift within himself. He had built a career on the idea of justice, yet in that single encounter, he had failed to embody it. The general's presence, calm and unyielding, reminded him that justice means nothing without empathy, and authority means little without humility. Respect cannot be demanded by force, it must be earned and recognized through action. The general's example made that clear. His strength lay not in reminding others of who he was, but in showing them who they should have been. He treated everyone in that courtroom with the same calm politeness, even those who had humiliated him. That consistency, that unwavering grace, revealed the kind of discipline and morality that authority alone could never teach. His behavior wasn't just about self-control, it was about setting a standard. He showed that equality begins not when others see your worth, but when you never let their ignorance take away your sense of it. As the judge finally addressed him with respect, his tone carried the weight of realization. The courtroom, once ruled by assumption, was now ruled by awareness. Every person present understood that something profound had taken place. They had witnessed how quickly perceptions can crumble when confronted by truth. The general didn't need to remind anyone of his accomplishments because his character had already done that for him. His calm defiance of prejudice wasn't just a personal victory, it was a reflection of the struggle many face when their worth is questioned because of their identity. In that sense, his silence became a voice for countless others who endure similar treatment without ever receiving acknowledgement. The officer sat quietly, his earlier arrogance replaced by introspection. He realized that respect is not about who holds the power, but about who recognizes humanity in others. The general's discipline had not only exposed his own disrespect but also taught him that equality begins in attitude, long before it becomes law. The way he had looked at the man, spoken to him, dismissed him, all of it revealed a kind of conditioning he could no longer ignore. The shame he felt now wasn't about being caught, it was about finally seeing what he had become blind to. The general's conduct had stripped away his excuses and shown him the real meaning of strength, not control, but compassion. Equality has always been fragile in the presence of ego. The judge, now softer in tone, began to understand that fairness isn't measured by procedure but by perception. The law can dictate behavior, but only conscience can dictate respect. In his years of serving the bench, he had believed he was a fair man, but the events of that day revealed the subtle prejudice hidden in his authority. The general's quiet endurance had exposed how easy it was for people to see themselves as just when they were only being comfortable. Equality isn't about treating the powerful with respect, it's about treating the powerless with dignity, even when there's no consequence for not doing so. The general's presence became symbolic of something greater than a single courtroom event. He stood for every individual who has ever been judged by appearance rather than merit, for every voice silenced by arrogance, for every act of grace ignored until power made it visible. His calm strength didn't just earn him respect, it reminded everyone that equality is not something to be granted after credentials are revealed. It is the foundation that should already exist in every interaction. The lesson lingered in the air long after the moment passed. The people in that room would remember the silence, the calm gaze, the dignity that never wavered. They would remember that respect, once lost, can never be fully reclaimed, and that true equality begins not when society enforces it, but when individuals choose it in their hearts without needing to be reminded who deserves it.